for joining me on this Friday at one of the last sessions here at our World Conference. I'm Sarah Wimberly, principal and founder of Ulster Technologies, based here in Philadelphia. And I'm happy to have you all join me as we talk through the what, who, and why of consent management. If you want to go to the next slide for me. Thank you. So through the next hour or so, with hopefully some good time for Q&A, we'll talk through really a foundational understanding of consent management, which is utmost importance when it comes to email marketing and marketing broadly. We'll talk through how an organization, big or small, can work through internal goals and data governance needs. And then the second half of our session will focus on an approach, a broad approach to how you can look for technologies that will help you deliver on these goals. Again, I'm Sarah Wimberly. I connect technology with the human experience and enjoy talking about these intersections between delivering value and managing people. I've served as an enterprise architect, product owner, program manager at leading regional and national healthcare institutions. I've led dynamic cross-functional teams through multiple product and platform migrations, all through driving business processes and driving growth, a lot of that in an automated way, which I know you've heard a lot about this week. So let's get into consent management. This is the active, holistic, compliant approach that an organization needs to take to track an individual agreed upon communication and cookie preferences. So you probably already know this, and I'm sure this is an everyday activity given the email marketing space that you're all in and exposed to on a day-to-day basis. But for those of you who might be new to it, this really is the mechanism through which an individual can opt in or out of topics they want. Could be at a unified consent approach where somebody says, send me all your emails, or it could be at a very detailed level where somebody is saying, I want to hear emails about health and wellness, but I want to get phone calls about billing. Really, there's a spectrum of how detailed that data can take. But it can encompass everything from email to phone calls to texting to snail mail, like postal service, and really can vary to your industry and what your organization really needs. But really the holistic aspect of this is the cookie preferences and those website tracking devices that really can make those consumer experiences better and give you a lot more holistic data about the user's browsing behavior. So if you consider something like Alexa or a Amazon product listing, back one slide for me. one more thing on the last slide, and then we'll continue to the degrees of data. So if you consider Alexa thinking through products, like you might be talking about something with someone else in your household, and then you see Amazon's serving suggestions for products that might be related to the thing you were just talking about. Or you search for something on Google and your mobile device shows you social media ads. That is, in a way, very similar framework to cookie data. But it's important to kind of get some context on why companies and organizations even need consent management. And this is, really the quick and easy way. And their answer to this is that they're sending out communications, right? So you need the consent to be able to hopefully automatically trigger who's in a segment, who's in the journey or the campaign. But the C-suite corner office strategic answer is that you as a team or as the organization are trying to create that meaningful relationship between an individual and a brand or a product or a service. You're trying to target users with that relevant information or advertising. And while it might not be in the scope of maybe data or cookie tracking, might not be in scope for maybe what you have in mind today, just know that only 11% of organizations 10 years ago used personalized cookies to deliver improved experiences to their consumers. That's 42% now. So this is a huge aspect of consent and preference management that is on the growing rise. So let's dig in now to degrees of data. So this is, back one more slide for me. So with the table that's on the degrees of data slide, we'll dig in a little bit through some of the nuances here. So we have really 4 degrees of data, 0 to 3, and going to talk through this table at a high level here. So we have each one of these degrees of data in some ways is a expanding circle, but every one of these has more or less importance depending on your industry, your risk tolerance as an organization, what your goals are as a marketing organization, what the journeys or the campaign's goals are, right? So some of these might be more or less important to you as an individual and as an organization. Zero-party data is collected normally from surveys, questionnaires, pop-ups. This can include consent preferences, but more importantly, it's critical to know that these are intentionally provided by the consumer, and we can assume that they're 100% accurate. First-party data is also data that your organization is collecting directly through an app or a website. Could be even authenticated engagement on your website if your organization offers like an account login or something like that. Could be downloads, purchases, orders, even loyalty program data. And this is data that is normally considered to be directly collected from the individual, but more passively. So yes, they are intentionally placing an order, but they might not necessarily realize that you're taking their order history and using it for a different organizational purpose. Second party data is the same type of data. So still order history, address, purchase history, transactional data, but it's shared from your company to another or from another company to you. So you might have a corporate partner that you use, whether it's a subsidiary, a mothership, or just a data sharing agreement with a tangentially related organization. And basically their first party data becomes your second party data. And last but certainly not least is third party data. So this is data that's collected by external parties, purchased or leased from aggregators or platforms. From a marketing services perspective, this could be something like a leased mass list, like from Experian, or even the Postal Service, if you're doing, a mass bulk rate postcard or something like that to a particular demographic or a particular metro area. And the last thing I'll mention here for this slide is that the blending of third and first party data might be the most powerful in marketing, in my experience, because of the nature of the data that you're blending together. But the piece of this, which is why we're all here, is that consent should only ever be considered when it comes directly from the individual. And really, again, depending on your industry, your organization, and your risk tolerance, more than likely can't or shouldn't be assumed from second or third party data. And this really matters at the end of the day. Back one slide for me, please. Thank you. This matters at the end of the day because people do have communication preferences. And this even came up in the last, one of the other talks that I was sitting in, that it's building the trust and the brand value. You're building that relationship, right? Not everybody wants to hear from you. And it's important to understand your product and your service in conjunction with the individuals that you're trying to reach. So the goal of the email marketing in general is to help individuals get what they want when they want it. And there's qualitative and quantitative reasons why we need to actively manage consent. And the big picture piece of this is it's brand value and trust. The bigger gray box I have here on the slide. But there's absolutely underlying components of that roll up to this, like shared values, reliability, transparency, the frictionless experience, and then security at the end of the day. So all of this, it works to improve and maintain that brand value. And I've seen marketing teams invest a lot of money, sometimes more, the biggest percentage of their budget on brand awareness. But if you are not managing consent or you're poorly managing it, it can absolutely degrade and take away from that. The success of an organization can really depend on these relationships, whether they're partner organizations or individuals in your organization. Word can spread quickly, whether it's good or bad news, and being able to stand behind, how your data is governed and managed, whether or not your campaign is as successful as you would like it to be. At the end of the day, having integrity for the data for the individuals that you're marketing to leads to that respect and value and trust. That honestly, for a lot of organizations, is baked into mission, visions, and values at the end of the day. So the flip side of this, which is the quantitative piece, you're avoiding costs, right? Long term, you might be running the risk of fines and penalties from your local national governments, right? If you're not compliantly managing consent, you can be sued. You can face fines and penalties from a lot of different individuals or entities, right? So it's really important to have in the back of your minds, you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, not just to meet your marketing goals, but also to, keep and maintain the respect and integrity of the individuals you're reaching, plus your organization. So let me do a quick gut check. Before we get into getting started, I am happy to, if there's any questions, we can pause here or we can continue on. So if there's any, I think we might have lost our slides too, but. I am not seeing anything in the chat necessarily, but I think we might have lost our...
Hi, Sarah. Just bear with me a second. Hi. I'm trying to get your slides back. Sorry, folks.
Okay. No, all good. It's the joys of technology sometimes. Yeah, there we go. And slide 7 works, the next one. Thank you so much. Awesome. Okay. So we'll dive right into kind of getting started. So now that we have kind of a base framework of, what is consent management, we can dive really right into how to make it happen, right? The kind of the enablement and implementation. So really at the end of the day, no matter how big or small your organization is, you need to be managing consent. Hopefully it's something that's more robust than a spreadsheet. Definitely more robust than Post-its and your Outlook email, address book kind of thing. But depending on your organization, you have more than likely different requirements at the end of the day. So going to kind of walk through a broad framework here to kind of set the stage, start hopefully getting the wheels spinning a little bit on potential questions, concerns, risks, impacts, all these kinds of things. So the first phase of this is really to start planning, and we need to identify all of the regulatory and organizational rules. So this is going to be based on where your organization resides. If you're in the US versus Europe versus UK, your country, your region. In the US, even state by state, there's different rules. And for 50 states, it gets a little ad nauseum, to be totally honest, but that's a big part of understanding the scope of what you need to work with and where your guardrails are. So it's not just based on where your organization's headquarters are. It might also be where your offices are, where your employees live, but then also where your customers or your donors reside, depending on what type of organization you are. So if you are based in Philly, like me, but your market area extends across state lines or even is an international organization, you're going to have a much bigger scope of regulatory expectations. And it's important to also know, if you can, and if you're aware of this information, to see and take into account future growth of the organization and expansion to kind of balance those short-term, long-term vendor capabilities. So, today you're a single office, you're headquartered in New York City, but 5 years from now, you want to be, have 5 offices around the world. That's an important consideration to make sure that the vendor or the platform that you're building or buying is able to scale with you. And you're not necessarily taking on tech debt or investing in a plan or partner platform that's not really going to meet your needs over the long term. And I touched on it a little bit previously, but it's also important at this stage to kind of gauge from from what you know, or even jot down what you don't know, as far as where the organization will land on the spectrum of unified consent versus nuanced flags. So there's really kind of two schools of thought from my perspective on this, where you can go all in on singular opt-outs. You can call me or text me or email me about anything and everything, or you can't talk to me at all, versus nuanced flags where it's more the topical based opt-ins. And that will vary based on your industry, the maturity of your products and services and organizations, and at the end of the day, what your ability to manage all of that will be. Then we need to go into what the business and the technology impacts are here. So where those impacts will lie will really depend on where you're centralizing or how you might be centralizing the data. Are you looking to enable marketing to pull lists faster or have more self-service? Do you want or need to account for different marketing personas? And then also kind of broadly what your enablement kind of aspects might be when it comes to maybe call centers, sales channels, things of that nature. So you don't necessarily need to have all of the answers at this moment in this conversation, or even before you really move forward in the vendor conversation. But these are all things to really consider to make sure that you're picking the best vendor for both short-term and long-term needs. Technology impacts, we'll go into that in just a second on the next slide. From a user impact perspective, you could go back a slide for me. Thanks. From a user impact perspective, it's important to consider, what the organization, the team's tolerances or interest in is enabling consumers to make changes for themselves. Is that something you want them to self-service, or do they need to place a phone call to you to change or opt in? Are they going to have an account to log in, for example, to make changes to their preferences? You also might need to consider internal support teams or admins, things of that nature. Always an audit trail, that's for sure. Internal timelines and budget is the last thing here, kind of from a planning perspective that I have captured. And this comes into effect, kind of harkens back to what we talked about from a cost avoidance perspective. So it's important to note if there is a timeline to meet or beat to fix a compliance issue. If you've been assessed a fine or been flagged in an audit, like a state or federal audit, then it's important to know what their expectation is for you to fix and respond and resolve the issue to avoid unnecessary or further compliance issues. And that may also that may or may not change budget constraints, but it's important to know if there is like a drop dead date that you need to find a vendor for to kind of push and make sure you have resources in play to work through that. So, and when it comes to a cost perspective, I'm sure you all are well aware, but the first 6 years is always the most expensive when it comes to implementation fees and startup costs in a way. But contractors, temp staff, project managers, legal advice if you don't have an internal legal staff to consult with, all of those are things that might come into play that you should consider to help offset that cost. So let's get into our tech impacts to consider here. So in the first column here on this slide, we have, I guess there's maybe 9 questions here on this slide between the 2 columns. It's important to note that some or all of these may apply to your organization, but it's things to kind of get the brain flowing here on a Friday, and work through kind of how this platform needs to fit in or work within the confines and the guardrails and the ecosystem of your organization. So we'll roll through them real quick. I'll share a couple of tidbits and examples along the way, but data storage. So where do you store your data today? Is it spreadsheets? Is it an on-premise, database or data warehouse? Are you in the cloud somewhere? Is all your data in one place, or is it decentralized and kind of scattered? Don't necessarily need to know all the details, but even at a high level, that's going to be really helpful to know as we move forward. And then how will this platform be used? By who? Is it just a marketing tool? Is it, or could other teams find value in this or leverage it? Are there a few people that might have access and need access? Are there hundreds of people that might need access? Ballpark figures are definitely helpful when you start talking to vendors, as access and users might have additional access and users might have cost. Data elements. So we did talk a little bit already about the nuanced flags, but are there other data elements that you might need in addition to the flag itself? So for example, in the healthcare space, audit trails are critical. And in my experience, we've had not just the flag itself, but the timestamp of when the flag was modified, and then what or who or what campaign may have flipped that flag, may have touched the flag and modified it. And we didn't start that way with all of those elements. It definitely evolved based on lessons learned and best practices and regulatory requirements that evolved over time. But it's important to consider what else you might need other than just the yes no to support not just an audit trail that would protect you and the organization from really kind of a worst case scenario, but what else is helpful for reporting, things of that nature. And then from a data movement perspective, so in theory, if you're working through these questions as we are now, the data is stored in a particular location. We'll just say, we'll say Google Cloud for sanity's sake. Does that data need to move between systems? Do you also have a CRM that maybe your call center uses? Do you also maybe have, an email marketing platform that you need to sync data with? And being able to, and understanding kind of that broader ecosystem, even at a really high level, is important. Even data moving between vendors, right? Maybe you today, you have a second party data relationship with multiple vendors and you're getting data and you're sending data. And then it's important to also consider and know if your new system or an existing system is the source of truth when it comes to this. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're absolutely going to get audited on a regular basis, but it's important to know that if there is an issue or an inquiry or an escalation, where you, the team, the organization can go in the event that happens, where essentially all the data across all systems, all pipelines, all sources is moving and syncing to a centralized place. And that centralized place should be your source of truth. So all the pieces are getting reconciled in one spot. And then that's the ultimate source for that audit trail data. It's also important to understand how frequently your data might need to be synced, and if synced for downstream systems, and not every system would have the same requirements. So we might have systems that need a real-time API, or you might have a pub sub that's would work best for the needs. You also might have daily, weekly, monthly processes. But again, it all depends on kind of the ecosystem and your organization. And along the downstream line data sync, the read-write back and forth is important to consider. From a broader data governance perspective, for growing and mature organizations, managing opt-outs is a baseline must. But then when you move into the nuances of duplicates and identity management, there's a lot more to unpack there. And it's important to understand if you're doing it today, how you're doing it today, and does that really work for your organization? And then we've talked a fair amount already on audit trail. it's for your organization, like healthcare in the States, we have to keep everything for 10 years. So knowing that requirement, that's important when it comes to either the vendor keeping the data on our behalf, us getting copies of the data, archiving it off to the side, storing it, knowing what is required for your industry, your organization, is important. So now we can move into partnerships, both internal and external. So when it comes to partnerships, first we got to get a list of people together, right? And this, like I said, this can be internal or external people. And after I go through these next couple bullets, I will go through the who's who in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. One other piece that's important when it's comes to considering partners and vendors is vendor location. So we've talked a little bit already about understanding where your organization is, where your consumers and donors and where your bubble is as an organization. But then when you think about vendors you might work with, different organizations have different expectations, whether the organization has to live in the same or reside HQ, I guess, or have an office in the same state, country, territory, region as you. That might shorten your list significantly. Every organization has a different tolerance of that, or even where their data centers might be. So you might be okay if the organization lives in or resides and is based in a different country, but their data centers have to be in the same, Microsoft region as you, for example. And that's going to shorten your list significantly. Because whatever vendor, whatever type of vendor you're looking for, whether it's, permission consent management or an email marketing or marketing in general, that can take what could be a 50 plus list of vendors to less than a dozen pretty quick. And competitive analysis is huge in the marketing space. When it comes to consent preference management, compliance and regulatory expectations and requirements is absolutely paramount in this space. But it's important to decide as an organization and as a marketing team if you care, to be totally honest, what competitors might be doing from a consent preference marketing perspective. You might not be able to identify this based on data available or based on the nuances of campaigns you might be able to get a hold of or get copies of. But if it's something that you want to dig into, just by nature of, learning more about the space that you're working in, then this is the phase of the kind of the research and the effort you would do that. And then last, but certainly not least, absolutely should review technology partners that you already work with. So you might actually have a vendor that's already contracted with you that has a different product in this space that you might not know about or might not be leveraging already. And that, especially if you have a fast approaching deadline from a compliance perspective to fix or improve a process you were audited on, this actually might be a faster or more cost-effective way, at least in the short term, to meet that need. And then you expand, services with an existing vendor versus starting from scratch and having to kind of restart that whole contractual process. So let's go to the next slide with who's who. So this is a really high-level list of potential stakeholders from an internal and external perspective that you might need to be working with as you consider consent and preference management. This, again, is just a starting point. Every organization and industry has their nuances, but the goal of this is to work to identify and engage appropriate stakeholders early in your project and early in this endeavor so that you have a full picture of what everyone needs as much as possible, so that everyone can find value in this effort. And not only are you realizing the ROI of the time and energy and effort, but you're meeting internal goals, you're maintaining data governance, you're not putting undue burden on teams or different systems. So you're bringing really this team together to bring together awareness, you're gathering requirements, as I mentioned, building consensus and getting that feedback. And key people, even from this list, could be providing legit requirements as the project goes on, They could be part of the contracting process. So these are great people to engage early on to make sure that their perspectives and their input are taken into account, so that you're building those relationships and you're having consensus and effective communication and building that collaboration. But engaging them early on keeps the discovery to delivery process as efficient as possible. So this is, everybody from privacy and compliance, who in theory are the subject matter experts on the rules, right? They should know your nuanced, the nuanced expectations for your organization, for your industry, and then data teams. So these are the individuals who know the ecosystem, know where your data is stored today and how it moves, who might be or who will be managing the product and the platform in the future. So who's going to be the product owner on that, whether it's a marketing team or a technical team, your marketing and sales team. So you, if you're doing this research, you're going to be using the data, you're going to be using the system. You might even want to bring in analytics, someone who might be building reports for you today on marketing campaign effectiveness, because these might be new metrics or measurements that you want to build into those existing reports. And while I don't recommend necessarily bringing in consumers into the process, that's a little bit more unusual. But it's important to understand and keep them in mind from a persona perspective and acknowledge that they are stakeholders in this, because it's the data integrity that we're trying to keep up that maintains that trust and builds that brand awareness in a positive way. So we can take another quick pause here. If there's any questions or anything of that nature that have popped up in our chat, you're welcome to add them. I think I should be able to see. All right. So let's go into selecting a vendor. At this point in the process, I'm rolling through this in 40 minutes, but this whole process, I've seen it take a week. I've seen it take a year. It really just depends on the complexity of your organization and where your knowledge and comfort is in this space already. If you're very close to this data already, you might fly through a lot of this stuff a lot faster. Or if you're new to the organization, or your organization is just starting in this space and in this kind of effort conceptually, this could take a lot longer. But in theory, when you get to this point where you're kind of in the demo phase, you have talked through and documented for sure impacts, and you've answered some of the getting started questions that we posed a few slides ago. And now it's really time to interview the stakeholders and that who's who list. You want to gather those capabilities that are the must-haves. What elements might be the deal breakers from anybody's perspective. Whether it's email needs to have the ability to do 10 topics, and these are our 10 topics. Understanding those nuances are really the early stages requirements in a lot of ways. If you do need to search for an external vendor, so for example, if you looked at your internal vendors and none of them met the mark or even offered a comparable product, see if your organization has a vendor management team. Most big organizations do, and that's their area of expertise. So they could help you in the initial research to put out an RFI. They'll walk you through the formal RFP process if your organization has one. But they can also connect you with, or may even have access already to resources like Gartner and things like that do a very frequently best of the best, even in the consent managed preference space, that can help you jumpstart your search. You can also use AI and our friends like ChatGPT to kick you back a list of vendors. Just know that still needs vetting and still needs due diligence. to make sure that it's a good fit for your organization. So at the end of the day, when we move into something like host product demonstrations, you want to have that list narrowed down to 3 to 5 vendors for sanity's sake and to keep the process moving, but also making sure that when you get to the demos and those appointments and those meetings and you're engaging your stakeholders internally, your privacy, your data, your product people, you're really being cognizant of their time and focusing on really the best of the best fit. So let's talk through some common capabilities. These are things that might come up in those stakeholder interviews. They also might not come up in the stakeholder interviews, whether because people aren't thinking about it, it's not come up in the past, or it might just not be applicable to your organization. So again, some of these may or may not apply, but things to think about and consider and just ask back to your group. So we've the ability to define and track consent elements. This is really that spectrum of unified consent versus nuanced flag. Do you want to be able to define and track? Obviously you want to track because that's why you're here, but define them. And how far in the weeds do you want to go with defining them? What is the organization's approach to identity management? And if you don't know what identity management is a very similar approach, right? A holistic approach, but on a person's record. So you're taking elements of data from disparate sources and engagement, and you're making sure that it's blended into basically a single record. Doesn't necessarily mean that all the data lives in one place. There might be keys, like data keys, or like a unique number or code that identifies that person, or that even if it's an anonymous person, right? But identifies that person across systems, so that at the end of the day, all those data elements and records across systems can be referenced back to a single place. But when it comes to identity management, knowing, first of all, if your organization does it, because if what I just said doesn't make any sense, might not be something your organization does, and that's okay. Not all organizations do it, but it can be something that would be something that would be very valuable to you when it comes to consent management. If you're collecting consent in disparate places and you need to bring those together, if you're collecting consent only in your call center conversations and only in your CRM or only on your website, you have a couple solid sources. But if you're collecting it on microsites and over here and over there and like a little bit everywhere, then it's important to kind of inventory those sources and make sure that they're, at the end of the day, all pointing to the same place, which could be a different project effort. But all of that relates back to identity management, because we want to make sure that all of the data is coming together so that we can track all the consent elements in one place, so that when someone opts out, they're opting out everywhere. A lot of these same preference companies and organizations also do cookie consent. So if you're looking for an organization that does both, you more than likely will find it. The flip side is not true in my experience. A lot of organizations that do website cookie consent management do not also do preference management. It's usually the other way around. If your organization has a robust call center and you need TPCA compliance support, that's important to understand whether or not that is a requirement and expectation, as well as scalability for volume and regulatory needs. So you might be starting small and you might be bringing together a couple Excel spreadsheets, but from your early research and discovery internally, we're about to go from one office to 5. So we need to really understand where we are today and what our volume looks like now, with hundreds of transactions to thousands of transactions, on top of regulatory needs and on top of what that might look like from the vendor managing those rules and regulatory needs, to enforcement as well. So is the vendor going to be responsible for looking up policy changes, privacy law changes, or is that something that your organization needs to keep an eye on and then inform the vendor? There's no right or wrong answer, just something to know and determine for your team and your organization what level of engagement you need from the vendor. If it's just implementation and then, they walk away, or if you need more of a white glove service kind of proactive like partnership. And then from a technical perspective, understanding and acknowledging where we might need this data to be integrated, how the data needs to move, right? So we touched on earlier understanding what current organizational ecosystem looks like, and now we need to understand where this new platform might fit in. It can't stand alone to the side because that would not add as much value as we likely need. So where does the data need to push and pull to make this the most robust, effective solution? And then last but certainly not least, UX options. So how, if consumers are going to be able to self-service their preference update needs, how are they going to be able to do that? Are they logging into the partner's platform directly? That's probably a feasible solution and a technically sound solution, but maybe not as great for your brand's and trust, right? To have people jump to a totally different website, totally different look and feel. There's a lot of platforms now that offer APIs to do that work, offer iframes even, that can make it look like your website, but people aren't leaving. So now, so this is, this little scenario example might feel a little silly, but not knowing, kind of the perspectives that our audiences are coming from, we'll kind of talk through this. So knowing that there's a lot of consumer or consent preference management products in the marketing today, we need to find a balance between capabilities and costs, right? So from, if you're more on the technical side of the equation and you're maybe less comfortable in the marketing space, or you're more on the marketing side and less comfortable in the technical space, this can be a tricky balance, right? It's tough sometimes to see from other team members' perspectives and be able to rationalize all that. But it is an important balance to understand and kind of strike, so that the short-term and long-term needs are balanced. But it's kind of the hidden factors here can be things like platform reliability, ease of use, scalability, even something where the company or the vendor you're considering, if they're a startup or they're a longstanding organization. No right or wrong answer, right? But it goes to risk tolerance and what your comfort level is as an organization. Can also be a lot about how they're marketing themselves, right? And what their support staff do. Even if they're a new organization, their team members might have worked in this space and in the industry for 10, 20 years, right? And so even though the organization's new, their bench is stacked with very reliable, very effective staff. And even understanding how that company, the vendor, communicates and uses consent management themselves is key, right? So now we will go into kind of going live and actually implementing them. Implementing your selected vendor is kind of a last step here from this vendor management perspective. So in theory, with the balanced vendor approach, you're really trying to find someone and a vendor who offers not the lowest cost per se, and not the most expensive, but the best capabilities, the best fit capabilities for a moderate cost. So I know we lost our slides here, but trust me, the slide that would be sharing is pretty cut and dry. So we'll just speak to it. So from a go live perspective, this is really when you're in your delivering phase of the project. And in theory, at this point, you've selected your vendor. If they're new to the organization, you're going through maybe a third-party risk assessment process. You're working through contracting, which can be a pretty long, daunting process. But if you've selected to expand with an existing vendor, hopefully that piece of this is shorter and it's an amendment or something like that. That's a lot more streamlined of a path for you. But the third-party risk assessment process, you would, in theory, go through if you have that process, whether you're expanding or it's a new vendor, because it's a new project, new scope with someone. And this is where individuals like myself as architects would come in to kind of guide through the process and make sure we have all these kinds of bases covered. And so that when we do move into implement and go live and the big red button is pushed and everything is kind of off to the races, we are balancing people, process, and technology so that we're remaining safe as an organization. The data is safe and secure, and the goals of the process and the stakeholders all are balanced. So I know looks like we have about 10 minutes left. I do have some kind of use cases, examples we can go through with the time we have, but I'm also happy to pause here and answer questions. If there's anything that's popped up in the chat, I'm happy to kind of play it by ear here. So I'm not sure if...
Hi there, Sarah. Looks like there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
But it's not in the Q&A bit. So folks, if you can put stuff in the Q&A, it makes it easier for the track lead. So how do you handle the DPO, which most of the time is not pro-business?
Okay, that's fair. So I guess by DPO, I mean, in my experience, that's been data protection officer. So if you mean something else by DPO, definitely let me know. I guess I've definitely faced that where data protection officers, CIOs, the folks very much on the heavy IT space might not always be pro-business. I would hope they're at least neutral, right? They're at least, maybe a little bit more moderate and neutral in that space. But I think it's important as whether you're directly going through this process on behalf of the marketing team, or you're helping to support the marketing team as, whether it's an analyst or PM or as an architect, helping them advocate. In my experience with data protection officers that are having a hard time, it's really that business case that kind of helps illustrate the business value, the ROI, articulating what the cost avoidance is, even if you haven't been hit by a fine or a regulatory, ding, putting that number down. If we don't do this, if we don't make this process better, we're at risk for X. And then for a DPO, if they're really embedded in IT and they're ultimately managing teams of data engineers and enablement teams and things like that, I would imagine they're the same team that's in charge of those data pipelines and the pub subs and the APIs and all of the enablement stuff that would make this platform go, and articulating, if you need to, and you can get to the level of detail in that business case. Today, when we work with your team, we have 5 people. It's, X hundreds of hours a month or a quarter, and that equates to so many dollars. If we can get a system that does ABC in-house, we could maybe we only need 2 people instead of 5. And then that gives you as a DPO, as an IT organization, resources back to go do something else. And we can start to self-service as a marketing organization. So I guess it's kind of the balancing act, and it can kind of take some time, but arming your leadership with information, that business case can help not only get funding if you need funding and you have a process that you have to go to get approval on a project like this anyways, but that same information can go and support hopefully a more proactive engagement with IT. All right. Ruth, I see another question in here about contrast between super simple consent pop-ups versus the ones that tell us everything you legally should know about what you're consenting to, and sometimes to the point of overwhelm. That's a really good question. I'm personally torn about this because from a professional perspective, I would share all the details. But personally, when it happens to me on websites, it is overwhelming and it is annoying. So I think in partnership with your legal privacy team, I think it's fair and appropriate to have a link to the details, but perhaps in those couple of sentences, use layman's terms, right? In healthcare, we aim for like a late elementary school, 5th grade, clear and simple language reading level. And I think if you could translate the really heavy, overly cumbersome legalese with a couple of sentences that says, we collect marketing data to send you personalized emails and make our website better and, provide personalized articles on our website, like whatever it might be doing, with a link to all the legalese, that might be a happy medium. But if you are also engaging with your analytics and reporting teams early on in this process, whether you're looking at cookie consent data or even consent preference marketing data, measure that. Like make a tweak and do it on a date and can mark down, and then measure the good, bad, ugly change that might be happening. And one of the third use case that I actually have here on web traffic touches on that. I know we're almost out of time, but the piece of that and kind of working in agile, if you do that as well, you're making little incremental changes. And I think when it comes to something like permission and consent management and the tweak of the pop-ups, it's important to kind of see over time if that's having the lift you're really looking for. You also could consider, if your tech stack allows it, if you can, do some A/B testing with this, right? We do A/B testing with everything else in marketing. Do it here too. You're able to display different pop-ups based on regions, or as long as you're still meeting compliance rules at the end of the day. Could you split the US, for example, and this region of the US sees this version and this region of the US sees a different version, and the metrics before were comparable, so let's make 2 tweaks and see what happens. I think a lot of ways we can improve campaigns and engagement just take some nuanced kind of trial and error, for better or worse. But as long as you're staying compliant and you're able to use the data you're collecting at the end of the day, that's really the most important thing. All right, one more question, I think, here. So how do I feel about the statement that I need to store the consent, including identifying the device time, versus simpler privacy-aware tools that query consent and enable listening to that without central data storage? So I do agree with the latter of that. So window just popped up on me. So I would vote. I guess it depends on who's looking at the data, right? Your data engineers, your IT people, your compliance people might need the nuanced, detailed data. And you might have to store that consent data in its entirety and all the nitty-gritty details for 5 years, 10 years, whatever makes sense from a compliance perspective. But simpler privacy-aware tools, to your point, could be listening to that data to support marketing. So if you're using, your email marketing tool could be listening to that data and just pulling in the pieces it needs to do what it's doing, whether that's an automated way or you're doing data pulls. But I would, I guess, from a data perspective, I'm probably more conservative, and I would store it even if I don't know that I'll ever use it or look at it, because you just never know, and you can't make up that data later. But if you have the data and you never use it, it's not hurting anybody. But I think there's kind of, maybe, hopefully that helps. There's more scenarios maybe where listening, to those privacy-aware tools makes sense in a self-service perspective. But all the data, maybe even, device data, time breaks, day parts are big. If you do TV advertising, maybe day break and time parts could be important to website traffic too. Really just depends on your organization. So thank you guys so much. I really, it's been fun to kind of chat this morning about consent preference management. And Ruth, if you could humor me and go to the last slide in the presentation. This is okay. So I added a different slide on my version, but so this is a QR code to me and my info. You're welcome to reach out if you have questions, concerns, want to chat further on the topic. I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me. I'm like this has been like a big journey for me. This time last year I was petrified of public speaking. So I just want to say thanks and to you all for humoring me and attending today and helping me meet my kind of 2025 professional development goal. This is my last planned session for 2025, and very pleased to say that I met and exceeded my goal of doing 12 sessions in 2025, and just big thanks, and hope you guys all had a wonderful conference and enjoy, I think, our closing remarks that are coming up here soon.
We are the Mautic community, open hearts and unity, back to the source where dreams belong, together loud, together strong. We are the Mautic community, forever proud, eternally, back to the source, the code lives on, the world's connected. We are one.